Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our sixth day on our kind of pre-contextualization unit, and we're going to do a kind of a brief overview on Buddhism and Confucianism, try to provide some kind of contextual coverage of those topics so that when we look at places that are influenced by them later this year, you'll have a better idea. All right, so we're going to start with the Daily Five, so please feel free to go through these, pause, and try to get your answer, and I'll just tell it to you. Okay, so this is just our active here. All right, so the answer here is number 1. Go ahead and have a look. The answer is number 1. Go ahead and have a look. The answer is number 4. Go ahead and have a look. Answer is number 4. All right, and maybe I'll talk about this when we get to this in a little bit. Land bridge, might be another way to call it, but a bridge in which culture was diffused, right? A land bridge in which culture was diffused from China to Japan. All right. So in class, I take a moment on this after students correctly get the answer, which is 1. And just kind of identify the word from the homework last night that explains this concept, because this is a very important concept. So make sure you're able to identify that word. And that word is this, filial piety. And so what is filial piety? There you go. That kind of concept. All right. So what answer is this? Obviously 4. And the answer here is 4. And the answer here is 1. And the answer here is 2. Okay. That's from the Four Noble Truths. And the answer here is 4. This is literally the 4th of the Four Noble Truths. Obviously, the answer here is 2. And once again, which philosophy or religion is this? Confucianism. All right, so we're going to run through the basics of Buddhism here. I'm not gonna get into the kind of story of Siddhartha Gautama or sightings or any of that. It's interesting. I always kind of find that to be interesting, but but generally most of my students have already covered that in earlier classes, like 7th grade. You kind of go through that stuff. So I just want to kind of start off by kind of introducing the concept. And that's the concept of schism, all right? So Buddhism is an example of a religion that comes about as a result of a schism. So what is a schism? In class, I very rarely have a student who knows what that is off the top of their head. And so I ended up kind of giving you an example of something that you're more familiar with, and then we kind of go from there. So let me kind of give you the example that students are familiar with. All right, so if this were a timeline, of what we talked about in the last class, so Judaism, right, goes back about 4,000 years ago. Judaism was continuing through its various challenges, like Babylonian captivity and occupation by Ptolemaic and Suclid and Roman occupation, and then there is a schism that occurs about 2,000 years ago. All right, so about 2,000 years ago, something takes place, right, and on the other side of that schism, people continue practicing their faith the way that they had previously, right? But there were some people who had previously identified as Jewish who began to identify a person, an individual named Jesus, identify him as a Christ figure, right, or as a Messiah. So the people who identified as Jewish previous to this, who agreed that Jesus was a messianic figure or a Christ figure, they become Christians. Those who do not believe that Jesus was a messianic figure or a Christ, they will remain Jewish. Okay, so a schism takes place. So that being said, you now know what a schism is, right? And so then I go on to kind of ask, are there any other examples of schisms within Christianity, or is that it for Christianity? And most students are able to identify what's sometimes referred to as the Great Schism in 1054, where you have Orthodox Christianity kind of officially separating from Latin Christendom or the Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, right? Then of course there's another schism 500 years later in the 1500s. Early 1500s, that's Martin Luther and Protestant Reformation, and et cetera, right? All right, so with that all being said, if there is a existing religion and a schism occurs and Buddhism comes out of that, what is the religion in which the schism occurs? So, or another way to put it is, what was the religion of Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, right? And most students are, having known that, it's pretty easy to identify Hinduism. All right. So yes. So that being said, right? Buddhism does reject a number of things associated with Hinduism. Like, for example, they reject the caste system. They reject a lot of the ritualism associated with Hinduism. There's a lot of things that they reject, right? But there's also a couple fundamental things that they believe that's universally true, and regardless of what kind of Buddhism we're talking about. All right. So one of the things is Four Noble Truths. As a student, you don't need to know all four of these things. You simply need to be able to recognize that the Four Noble Truths is a component of Buddhism. All right. So that said, I do like to kind of in class just go through these really quick and explain them, just so that you've at least come into contact with that. So here we go. The Four Noble Truths, right? So as a Buddhist, you need to acknowledge, number one, that life is suffering, pain, and sorrow, right? Life is full of pain, suffering, and sorrow. That is true regardless of where you are. One could say that students who live in the United States today have never experienced any more suffering, pain, and sorrow than anyone else in all of human history. You can if that were a claim, you could use as evidence, the high depression rates that exist in the United States today. Higher probably than any other place or time in history ever, right? So because of that, I think that would support the assertion that a teenager living in the United States today is suffering and in more pain and more sorrow than any other place in all of human history. All right. So never mind what is going on in the news today in Afghanistan. What is going on there is nothing compared to being a teenager in the United States. I could also cite as evidence, I watch every once in a while, I will go to TikTok and I see all the evidence I need of that suffering, pain, and sorrow. All right, so that being said, the second of the Noble Truths, and go ahead and read that. I'll be right back. I got someone at my door. Yeah, go ahead and look. Just close the door on your way out, okay? All right, number two, right? So suffering, pain, and sorrow is caused by desire for illusionary things such as life, right, power, etc., etc., etc. Number three, the Noble Truths, right? To end suffering, one must end desire for illusionary things. All right. So, right, the cause of this pain, suffering, and sorrow is you desire things that are illusionary, right? Are they really real? So look at the struggles of the average American teenager. How do those compare to someone living in Kabul right now? In August, mid-August of 2021, right? So, are these real? Are these real things, or are they simply illusionary things, right? That exist in your head, So, if you want to not experience pain, suffering, and sorrow, maybe you need to stop desiring things that are illusionary, right? And number four. Number four is an 8-step program, right? So, you're not simply being told to stop doing it. There's a series of actions you can take, right? And that is the Eightfold Path. So, like the Four Noble Truths, you don't really need to know the individual parts of this. Just know that the Eightfold Path is Buddhism, right? And what I do in class with this is I just do a very brief similarity comparison to something many students are more familiar with, and that is the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, or from the Old Testament Christian Bible, or from the Torah, from the Tanakh, the 10 Commandments, right? That moral code, religious code, right? So the reason I kind of make a similarity comparison here is to point out there are some things in here that are really easy, and there are some things here that are really challenging. There is an order to these things, and they start off very easy, and they become increasingly more challenging. So I make a similarity comparison first by talking about the 10 Commandments. And once you get through the first 4 of the 10 Commandments, which are about religion, and these are religious idea codes, and about monotheism, number 5 through 10 are more civil and moral, or civil behavior, right? Moral behaviors, right? And they start off pretty easy, right? So 5, 6, and 5 and 6 and 7 are kind of easy, and then they get really, really challenging and really, really difficult. So with that said, let me give you an example, right? So something like "Thou shalt not kill." That's really not that hard to follow, right? So unless you are a sociopath, you can usually control your desires to do such things. "Thou shalt not steal." Once again, not that hard to actually try to live by those kinds of codes, but they do get really difficult by the time you kind of get to the latter ones, right? So "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbors," etc., right? That's hard. How do you not want what someone else has? And we're not talking about doing anything. We're talking about thinking at that point, right? Coveting is in your head. So how do you not do that, right? So these things become increasingly more challenging, so obviously many people will struggle to do that, right? Very similar here to the Eightfold Path. Some of these are really easy, right? So say nothing to hurt others. This is something that I talk to my children about when they're young. About seeing somebody walking down the street and not like asking me about it, or saying something out loud, maybe about their hair or their clothes or some piercings or something like that. It's okay for stuff to go into your head, but it doesn't need to come out your mouth, right? You need to filter, right? So by the time you come to high school, most of you are pretty good at filtering what you say, and that's a pretty easy thing to do, right? So that's kind of easy, right? But some of these are really hard. Right, so as you kind of go down this list, control your thoughts. Well, how do you do that? That is challenging, And when I go over this in class, I always challenge students to walk from my class across campus, during a class change, and not think about somebody in a judgmental way. Not even one person, in a judgmental way, whether it's their hair or their clothes or who knows, whatever. It's hard. Right? It is hard, and maybe you're more enlightened than I am, but it is a challenging thing. So how do you do such things? Right? One of the ways that that is done. One of the ways that you can do this is maybe remove yourself from situations where you're going to come into that kind of stuff. So one easy way to do that within maybe Christianity or Buddhism, because both of these have it, is through monasticism, right? So if you give away all of your possessions and you shut yourself into a monastery where you can read, sacred texts all day long, and only interact with other people who are trying to kind of keep nothing but pure thoughts, then, that's a little easier, right? In order to come up with this, a little bit more challenging when you are out in the world, right? And being exposed to all of the pain, suffering, and sorrow that exists out there, all right? All right, so the Eightfold Path. All right, so with that all being said, right, so Buddhism originates, right, in this region about 2,500 years ago, and from here diffuses, right, and from here spreads, right, and there's a couple of ways in which things spread. So in class we kind of go through these really quick and right, just kind of talk about this. So really quick, when you're talking about this stuff, what are ways in which religions diffuse? And I really want to come up with just a couple of categories of analysis you could use if you are ever asked about how religions are diffused. And really, there's three basic ways. I mean, there's a bunch of others that come up that are specific to specific religions. However, there's if you want some general ones that apply to most, real quick, I just want to run through this. One is conquest. Right, conquest or by the sword, right? So religions are spread via military conquest. So, Islam was spread from the Arabian Peninsula into, throughout the Middle East, or through the Middle East, across North Africa, into the Iberian Peninsula by conquest. Okay, and when you talk about the diffusion of something like Islam, that is where the diffusion of that religion stopped by conquest. So all of the diffusion takes place through different means. Christianity was diffused into the Americas via conquest, right? Et cetera, right? So that's one basic way, all right? So another common way in which religion is diffused, and this one is one of the ways we're going to talk primarily about Buddhism, is merchant. Right, merchant activity or trade. Okay, merchants will spread religions. So there's and this could just be within Buddhism. That's kind of an interesting case study how it spreads across the Silk Road. There is a concept that we'll get into in especially unit 2, called diasporic merchant communities. Right, and we will see religions spread via diasporic merchant communities. All right, so that is kind of one way in which this happens. You could also kind of get into more specific case studies like migration. Migration for economic reasons. That is one way you could explain, like for example, the diffusion of Hinduism into the United States. That's trade. Right? That's economic kind of activity. Right, so there's also, let's move on. All right, 3, this kind of last one is missionary. Right, missionary activity. And just kind of using missionaries as a generic concept, there's a couple of different examples of how this might work. One is within Christianity. In Buddhism. All right, Christianity and Buddhism. So in Christianity and Buddhism, you have monks and nuns. Okay, and it is surprising, how few people I teach are familiar with the fact that there are monks and nuns that exist within Christianity. It is ironic because we do have a pretty well-attended private school in about 2 blocks from where I am currently sitting, called Francis Xavier, which is named after a Jesuit monk, right? So, Jesuits are a monastic group, right? So there's but monasticism. So when you talk about like diffusion of Christianity into the Americas, it is diffused to the Americas via conquest, but it is spread into throughout the Americas via missionary activity. Your Jesuits, your Dominicans, your Franciscans, the Augustinian monks, etc., etc. Right? There's all kinds of officially recognized monastic organizations that exist. Okay, all right. So that's kind of one way, and these aren't really monks or monasticism per se, but it's very similar, to kind of how this missionary activity works. Let's just call it Sufism, right? Or Sufi mysticism. All right. So, like, for example, Islam spreads to sub-Saharan West Africa via trade and merchant activity, but diffuses beyond places like Mali and the Songhai Empire, kind of away from the major cities into the interior of those regions via Sufism. All right. Same could be said about, spread of Islam into Southeast Asia. Islam spreads into Southeast Asia via merchant activity, the establishment of diasporic merchant communities, but becomes widely adopted because of Sufism. Sufism takes the form of things like poetry and literature and song and dance, and does, and at times does result in some syncretism. Okay. So we talked about diffusion of religion. These are pretty generic categories of analysis that match up with almost every religion, right? So you do get occasional things that are that might be unique to one religion, but those are some generic categories of analysis for you to use someday. All right. So we're talking about diffusion of Buddhism. Buddhism takes a couple of different ways, right? So one is, let's just kind of say real quick, Buddhism during the Mauryan, right? During the Mauryan era, you've got Ashoka, okay, and that is an empire, and then you see kind of the conquest, the spreading in South Asia because of that. And that's probably the only time you're going to see, Buddhism spread by a conquest, out. So the rest of this is merchant activity, and then, intensification through missionary works and the such. Okay. All right. So that being said, there's a number of different branches of Buddhism. So I just want to run through kind of the 3 more dominant. One is Theravadin Buddhism. And when you talk about Theravadin Buddhism, this is highly monastic. You generally see this in Southeast Asia. And, this is individuals removing themselves from society in order for them to kind of fulfill the tenets of Buddhism so that they can achieve nirvana and in their cycle of rebirth. Okay. Sometimes this is called small boat Buddhism because it is targeted at very select few individuals being able to attain salvation, and the rest of society generally supports these individuals who are trying to achieve this goal. All right. Next, we call, I think the easiest way to call this is Diamond Vehicle Buddhism. In the U.S., it's generally just kind of referred to as Tibetan Buddhism. We see a prayer wheel here. I do have one in class that I do use, but it's way over there. So we'll leave it at that. So there's prayers inside here, prayer scrolls inside these, and you spin these as you walk by, spreading the prayers. All right. Mandalas. Okay. Dalai Lama, right? The spiritual leader of Tibet. Right, so there you go. And then, of course, we have Mahayana Buddhism, or sometimes referred to as Big Boat Buddhism. You know, and when we talk about Big Boat Buddhism, it is trying to, you know, make Buddhism more accessible to the masses so that it's not just a select few who are able to achieve nirvana or achieve the end of their cycles of rebirth, but trying to get as many people as possible. So big boat or big raft Buddhism, trying to get as many people across that gulf to achieve nirvana as you can. And we often see associated with this form of Buddhism, actually these top two, because this is a derivative of this, these bodhisattvas, right? So the Dalai Lama is an example of this. So this is the idea behind the bodhisattva is that this is someone who has achieved salvation, but instead of kind of crossing that gulf to nirvana, they've decided to be reincarnated back here on earth to help others achieve, so to become teachers, to become guides, if you would. So we often see that associated with those latter two forms, non-Theravadin. All right, so talking about Buddhism, once again, just speaking of diffusion, as Buddhism spreads out of South Asia, you're going to see a transition from some of the imagery we associate, and it's always good to be familiar with this imagery. So for the first couple hundred years, imagery representing Buddhism or Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha was often stuff like this. All right, you know, some of this is kind of obvious, some of this is symbolic. All right, so from the mud, the muck of the bottom of the swamp, grows one of the most beautiful flowers. Right, so highly symbolic kind of stuff, right? And then around 200 BCE or so, we see as Buddhism begins to make its way into the southern part of Central Asia, you know, kind of what is modern day Afghanistan. You're going to see it coming into contact with Greek culture. So this is after Alexander the Great had come through and then had died, and we see the rise of these you know, these kingdoms of his former generals, like Suklid and such, right? So with those new Greek, kingdoms, you're going to see Greek culture being diffused across this region of the world, what is today the Middle East. And as Buddhism comes into contact with that Greek culture, you'll sometimes see what is often referred to as Greco-Buddhism or Buddhism influenced by Hellenism. All right, and this is when you're going to start to see, you know, first human depictions of Siddhartha Gautama in statue forms and such. Right, so this is Greek art being applied now. All right. All right, so continuing our diffusion talk here. So as Buddhism had made its way up into Central Asia, then it gets onto the Silk Road and then begins to diffuse its way across. So this is a really good example of diffusion of Buddhism via merchant activity. So on the Silk Road, when you're talking about the Silk Road, go through all this. And when you're talking about moving across the Silk Road, you know, people aren't moving and selling goods from like here to Chang'an. That's not happening, right? People are traveling, you know, 3 to 5 days, making some trades and then going home. You know, very short little hops along the Central Asian steppe, across the Gobi Desert, et cetera, right? So when it's very hot, or where they spend the night, where they want safety, are generally a series of caves along the way. And in some merchants who had been successful, maybe they were practicing Buddhists, so they used some of their profits to give back and maybe to celebrate the religion that they may have associated good fortune with. Right? So we see these kinds of complexes throughout Central Asia, right, as a result. So Buddhism spreads very slowly over the course of hundreds of years, and eventually making it to China near the end of the Han era, right? So you see here, this is the Longman Caves. We're up in northern China now, kind of northern central China. not terribly far from what is today Beijing. Right, so yeah. And if you notice the time frame on this, right, this is 450s. We start to see this. I do like to kind of just run a quick little timeline here, just as a way to kind of deal with both of this. So as far as dynasties that we need to be familiar with, I mean, we don't really need to know the Qin, but sometimes you'll see Chang'an, right? This is the kind of historic capital of the Qin dynasty. Today, it's Xi'an, right? You'll see it on the map today. Xi'an. This is where, you know, Emperor Shi Hongdi, right? This is where he established his kingdom. Qin is where we get the word China from today. And this is the old kind of Silk Road destination, right? So an interior capital, right, during that era. This will eventually give way to the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty runs from about 200 to 200. Okay, so a little bit before 200 BCE and a little bit after 200 CE. So this is the, you know, kind of a contemporary of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was kind of on that western end of the Silk Road. The Han Dynasty was on the eastern. And it's during this time that the Silk Road gets established through bureaucracy and Confucianism. It's part of that story, all right? Kowtow, right? Tribute system, right? Those are the things that create the Silk Road initially. Right, so during this time frame, this is when we will see the rise of Confucianism. Right, and Confucianism originates around the same time as Buddhism does. At the same time as Siddhartha Gautama was alive, but as far as it being established as a state philosophy, that's gonna be during the Han era. You know, so it's during this Han era that we see, you know, the first kind of imperial institution. You know, the imperial school, right? It's during this time that we see the beginnings of the civil service examinations, right? The civil service examination system is during this time. We first start to see that. And this is being used to establish a meritocracy, especially when we're talking about the government bureaucracy. Right, so if we're talking about a government bureaucrat, how do you get your job in the government bureaucracy? You know, the traditional way would be things like nepotism. So the son of so-and-so would get this position, right, as a, you know, sign of loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. You know, highly feudal kind of stuff, right? That's nepotism when you get your position because of who you are, you know, not your performance, right? So Confucianism, as Confucianism gets adopted, it has certain societal things, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it also establishes meritocracy as the path towards rising in the hierarchy of society, right? So we associate these things. You know, the Han Dynasty bureaucracy was massive compared to like the Roman bureaucracy. So the Roman bureaucracy, talk about around the time of the peak of the Roman Empire, around the time of like say Marcus Aurelius in the late 100s CE. You may be talking about a bureaucracy of in the range of 20,000 to 25,000 bureaucrats in the Roman Empire. A comparable time in the Han Dynasty saw over 100,000 bureaucrats, right? So much larger bureaucracy, much more centralization of authority, much more control, right, of their society, right? So Confucianism, and then from there, right? So it's in the early 200s, right? In the early 200s, you're going to get a break, right? The Han Dynasty will collapse. And you get about a I guess more of a 300 year, Y-E-A-R, right? 300-year period of what you would call a warring states period. And out of the backside of that comes the Sui dynasty. Okay, it's during this 200-year warring states period where highly decentralized, fragmented, right? But it's during this period that Buddhism spreads throughout China. So when China comes out of this period of time and we see centralization reemerge with the Sui, Confucianism is still there, right? But Buddhism will be kind of increasingly growing prominence, right? So from the Sui, we then have the Tang, right? And then we eventually kind of make our way to, I'll kind of throw this over here, right? So from the Tang, continued, okay, to the Song, right? And this Tang dynasty is often referred to as the golden age of Chinese history. Kind of go back, right? It's kind of like a golden age of Chinese history. The Tang into the Song dynasty. This is the time where there's really not much in comparison to power, economic power, kind of technological achievements that you're seeing from the Tang dynasty. The only thing even remotely close is what's going on in the Abbasid Caliphate, at this time, right? So, but yeah, very, very important in Chinese history, the Tang dynasty. But it's during this period where Buddhism hits its peak. Right? Buddhism hits its peak in China. Massive temple building campaigns going on. Buddhism is being diffused out of China along with other economic things going on. You're seeing cultural diffusion right into Korea, what is today Vietnam, what is today Japan. During this era, along with other things. Obviously, written language is diffused, by that Korean land bridge. Written language, all kinds of other cultural components are being diffused, right? From China into Japan via Korea. All right. So this is where we see our peak. We even have an empress who, which is why I started talking about this. We have an empress who kind of identifies herself as a bodhisattva within Buddhism, and that is Empress Wu. Empress Wu of the Tang dynasty. Right. So Empress Wu Tang, Wu of the Tang dynasty. All right. And so she is not a dowager empress, right? So oftentimes there's all kinds of empresses who rule China throughout history, but you'll almost always see them identified as a dowager empress, which means their husband died and their son is not old enough to take over yet. So they will be a place filler whose decisions are made by a council of men, right? Kind of Confucian bureaucrats usually. Kind of making the decisions until the son becomes old enough, right? So often you'll see dowager associated with an empress, but there's very few empresses who are truly in power. Empress Wu being one, probably the second closest would be Empress Shiji in the late 1800s, and we'll talk about her later in the course. Okay, so we see Buddhism peak out here, right? We see Buddhism peak out here, and you can see here. At the Longman Caves, right, we see a depiction commissioned by Empress Wu of herself, right? So this is her as a bodhisattva in the Longman Caves. Okay, we also see other things diffused along the Silk Road attached to Buddhism, such as pagoda architecture. Right, so diffused, first seen in China in Chang'an across the Silk Road. And then this is also diffused, the kind of cultural component that gets diffused across East Asia. So today you'll see pagodas in Japan and the such. All right. So, but yes, originally, a South Asian thing. All right. So let's transition really quickly because I'm probably already going long into Confucianism. Right. So Confucianism has some basic organizing principles: status, age, gender. We associate the 5 relationships with this, so that 1 through 4 is a hierarchical one, with one being on top and the other being below. And filial piety is required of that lower position. So you must show loyalty and obedience, right? Filial piety. But the superior also has to set a good example and protect and educate the inferior. So there's a dual obligation associated with this, okay? And then there's an equal status as well, right? So pay each other respect. So this is one of those things where, as an organizing principle, Confucianism, it starts in the family, right? And then, starts at the grassroots and then works its way up. So you can't expect to have an orderly society unless you have an orderly family, right? So you need that family structure to be in place, right? And if the family structure gets broken, then society will be broken, right? If so, it is, it's as an organizing structure, right? It's a really bottom up one, and yeah. All right. So once again, I've already kind of mentioned that, when we think about Confucianism in practice, we don't think a lot about the relationship part of it, even though that is such a fundamental part of it, the filial piety aspects of it and the relationships, but it manifests itself through things like examination systems. So the civil service examination, when you hear that, that's Confucianism, right? So think of Confucianism when you hear that. That is meritocracy, all right? And this is one of those things where, it does come and go in influence. So there are times in which, in Chinese history, where you're not going to see Confucianism as a major part of things. Like, for example, the Yuan era, kind of when it's under foreign Mongol control, right? And also, in the 20th century, Mao will do away with Confucianism. This gets termed this is one of the four olds. Confucianism is viewed as too feudal and is purged from China. So, so you'll Confucianism will be absent in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But has made a revival in the last 15 or so years. So for various social reasons, you are seeing a return of Confucianism in China. All right. So, and of course, anytime you talk about high stakes tests, you're going to have people who cheat. Okay. It's just, was the old Yogi Berra quote there? If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Right. So yes, don't ever be surprised when you come across cheaters. But those tests determine merit, right? One unique thing about China here is that you didn't have to be of a certain social status to take the test. So there was a degree of social mobility. That being said, however, obviously these examinations require a massive amount of testing and resources and time dedicated to study, in which certain socioeconomic groups are going to have an advantage over others. There are plenty of stories of individuals being recognized within specific villages and villages pooling money together so that those kids could study and take the test and rise up. However, there are certain realities that do exist when it comes to socioeconomics, no matter what time in history you're talking about. All right, but we do have the establishment of a meritocracy and, of course, a large bureaucracy that gets created as a result of this. So this is kind of a look at the Han bureaucratic structure, right, of their society. All right, kind of go back to this real quick. All right, so if this is the peak of Buddhism, right, so if this is kind of the peak of Buddhism, something happens, it's after this period. Something happens at the end of the Tang era. It's called the Al-Ashan Rebellion. And the Al-Ashan Rebellion is, you could make an assertion that it is the deadliest war ever in human history. Okay, so So if I were to make that assertion, right, there are a number of different ways that you can look at the deadliest wars in all of human history. You could look at total number of dead in a war, right? So if you are using total number of dead in a war, then World War II is the deadliest war in all of human history. If you are using the percentage of people on Earth alive who were killed in that conflict, then the Al-Ashan Rebellion is the deadliest war, using that as your criteria. So there's a cataclysmic war that happens here at the end of the Tang era, the Al-Ashan Rebellion, right? Al-Ashan Rebellion. And that war begins out in the western provinces of China and will result in a massive anti-foreign foreign influence, right, spreading through China. Today, I think you would call that a xenophobic, right, a very xenophobic movement. So you're going to see a very real purge of anything foreign. So you are going to have in places like Huangzhou, Muslim merchants who live there, Nestorian Christian merchants established there. You're going to see a very real anti-foreign backlash take place in China at this point. And as a result, Buddhism is going to get targeted as foreign. So to be targeted as foreign, and so you'll see temples burned and persecution of Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then this will give rise to what's called Neo-Confucianism, right? This will give rise to Neo-Confucianism. So right at the end of the Tang era and then into the Song, right? Into the Song. And Confucianism, you can definitely make an argument or make the assertion that Confucianism is a philosophy up until you get to this point, right? And then once you get to this point, you could make an argument that Confucianism is a religion because it does adopt a lot of the components of Buddhism because Buddhism was popular and was widespread. This new kind of revival of Confucianism is going to take on a lot of Buddhist components. So I'm not going to read through all this, and I really don't even do this in class. I'm just kind of showing this to you now. You're welcome to pause and go through this if you'd like, right? But Neo-Confucianism, right, will take root at the end of the Tang, become the dominant philosophy in China during the Song era, and then kind of come and go, right? After that, we'll kind of rise again during the Ming era, and then during the Qing era, we'll kind of begin to decline in its prominence. Okay, all right, and of course, we see Neo-Confucianism in what is today Vietnam, Korea, and especially Japan, especially during the kind of early Tokugawa era of Japanese history. All right. Sometimes in class I have time for this, sometimes I don't. So if you're home watching this, you're welcome to stop now. If you want a little practice, right? So we're working on the same props as in the last video, develop an argument, right, about religious response to merchant trade wealth accumulation. All right, and I'm just going to give you a couple of documents. Feel free to pause and read. And I'm going to move on. And again. And I'm going to move on. All right, so that is it for today. Tomorrow we'll look at Christianity. Sapriati.